So yeah, as far as buff cards are concerned, so one of those interesting things about it is that every version of those kind of pre-stacked up cards that bosses will get, oftentimes are telling a little bit of a story. And like usually the complaint that comes up with the cards is something along the lines of, "Oh, it was unfair. I got one shot." And the interesting thing about it is that they're always set up to do something very particular, but they're always set up to the point where they almost never can actually one-shot you. Usually it's something else that causes that, like an element or a debuff or what have you. So, for example, somebody will ignore a breach and go attack somebody, or ignore an elemental disadvantage and go attack somebody, and it's like, yeah, at that point you're just kind of asking to get one shot, like, what are you doing? But what's interesting is that a lot of times they'll have a very particular kind of vibe that they're going for with the skills that somebody is loaded out with. Like when you run into the Leonard duel, he's specifically set up to constantly spam his finisher. So it basically becomes a check of like, do you understand how to shut down a finisher? Or for example, if you run into the Knight Commanders, they almost never actually have a second physical card on them. Instead, having some other thing to kind of emphasize who they are. Like the crazier ones will carry more crit cards. The more composed ones will carry more MP cards. The more defensive ones will have more skill cards and stuff like that. It's just interesting that they are more personalized than they get credit for. I just, again, think it's a neat little bit of characterization. Which actually, speaking of, I'm not going to have a copy of it here, because I haven't picked it up. Did I actually pick it up on this one yet? I don't know. I kind of stopped going for the Knight Commander weapons after a while. Yeah, no, I don't have it on this one yet. But the Apocalypse skill. So, the Knight Commander finishers, for those that didn't know, can be acquired by getting a hold of the Knight Commander weapons. So these are the weapons that can be gotten in Chapter 4 there. And effectively what they're doing is that they're essentially giving you one use of their particular skill. So like Crushing Blow here, we can go ahead and just use that 3 times without needing to do anything extra. Now this is probably also one of those reasons that they don't scale. Interesting thing about this though is that the Apocalypse skill is one of the very few that changed entirely between versions. So the Apocalypse ability originally back in PSP there would actually cause a unit to permanently lose one of their lives. It was the only thing in the game that could do that, and basically just meant that it could potentially insta-kill a unit permanently. Now, I say permanently, they would have to be hit by it 3 times in a row in a lot of cases, so it's weirdly specific, and it's probably also the reason that when it came to Alphonse, I guess you could say, Alphonse, Tardy, whatever you want to call him, he actually didn't carry his weapon skills with him in that version because it gave him access to Apocalypse, and so if you ran into him the first few times, he wouldn't use his signature skill there until like New Game Plus or so, because it had that potential to instantly one-shot somebody. But yeah, interestingly enough, it was actually changed this time around to permanently debuff a unit by 10 levels, essentially for until the end of the fight, and not getting knocked out. Not something like Mother's Mercy. Nothing could actually remove that particular debuff. It's a very unique debuff in that, again, absolutely nothing can touch it. So it's kind of interesting to see how much it had changed, and I mean, personally, I love the debuff version. The original kind of insta-kill version was very strange in that mostly what it did was punish doing a solo run, or punish somebody that had over-leveled during part of the game. Though, again, it's super weird that in a lot of encounters, when it came to Tardy, he just was given the 2-handed sword skill instead of the 1-handed sword skill. I like to think that there was some kind of story and playtesting behind that, but we don't know for sure. But it certainly feels like one of those things that had a story, you know? Okay, next is Fruit of the Adept. This was a basically useless item back in, previous versions in general, where it's essentially going to be healing part of your HP and MP. And this really did not matter much in those ones, because, like, okay, let's say you're going and you're playing PSP, right? You're kind of going towards the end game there. Your unit has roughly 250 to 300 health. what's 10% going to do for you exactly? Like, what's it going to help you with? You're what? You're going to get a basic mend leaf that cost you about 10 times as much? Are you crazy? So it seemed like a weirdly specific thing to go for there. But what's interesting is that this item got buffed without destroying what kind of made it itself to begin with, which is that tiny little trickle heal that it can do. See, there's better versions, there's better stuff out there, but it's the availability of all of these things that cause this previously useless item to see a lot of use. Like in this case, if you upgrade it all the way using a lot of items, it's a 75% HP and MP heal that's, pretty significant. If you were to upgrade it, basically it would go up to 25. If you upgraded it using some better materials, it goes up to 50%. What's interesting about this is that this chain made no reason to go up to back in PSP there, because it was just basically it was a super expensive version that didn't make sense to use most of the time. This time around, though, with the fact that your magic items, your leaves, your seeds, your salves and stuff like that, they're actually a rarity this time around. There's actually a reason to interact with this menu and upgrade these oddly specific items, and specifically the fruit of the Adept, which previously had no purpose whatsoever in the game, now had a ton of value. Because now, effectively, it's going to be about a 190 cost item that you can replenish as much as you'd like from any shop that is an MP restoral item that you can have on anybody, and especially happen to be useful on AI units because it would cause them to essentially heal both bars at the same time. And if you wanted to, let's say, then save up your other items here, it allows you to potentially save an inventory slot on somebody by going and combining both of those heals at the same time. It's just a really a really cool little thing here. I really appreciate this progression of this item because it's saving on inventory, it's giving you this oddly specific use case, it's giving you a very replenishable item that you can get from the very beginning, but it's also potentially turning it into one of the best items in the game. Again, totally useless in PSP, gets so much more love here. It's weirdly specific, but I love it. And actually, this actually goes into the next point on the list, which was MP leaf pickups. This is, again, just kind of a cool way of taking a look at a PSP mechanic and deciding, wow, this actually sucks ass if you think about it, and going and changing the thing so that it actually ends up being something cool. I've talked about this a little bit, but you could always pick up magic leaves on the ground, and this was more or less a, yet another useless pickup kind of moment in PSP, because it was just a basic item you could buy at the shop. This time around, it has more or less been reimagined as, well, medieval Europe, quite frankly, where in a lot of cases you had things like, the plant that makes hemp, that I don't know if that's still currently banned by censors or what have you. But either way, essentially it was something that people would just sort of pick up off the ground and go home and, kind of smoke in their pipe. And if you think that's going and rewriting history, there are literally Lithuanian folk songs about, the dad coming home and kind of like smoking whatever they had picked up along the way. It's kind of an interestingly specific thing. Anyway, as far as the names of those songs, I don't remember, but it's something that my brother had gone and brought up pretty extensively there. But what's interesting is that it gives it that interesting lore connection there over, people did this back in the day. All that stuff had to originate from somewhere. It gives it this additional value of just sort of being something that's around. The stores probably can't keep it in stock because it's just something that's around on the floor everywhere. And so this kind of creates this idea that people are just sort of picking it up in their castles. Why would they need to go to the store to buy something that they already have on hand in perpetuity, so to speak? Technically, then you should be able to have it as soon as you take over the castles. And technically speaking, you do have access to those maps. So, there's that, I guess. But yeah, it's just kind of an interesting little way to give these a bit more value. Like, it's initially seen as a way to balance out finishers and spells and such, but I just feel like in general it tends to lead to a fun balance where it gives this item more value. It tends to cause you to try and spam bars less, because one of the things you can clearly tell they were trying to do in this version was make you try to think about your options more. So I feel like that change definitely did that particular job. Alright, next up is going to be a relatively quick one, and that's going to be item beasts. So, yeah. For folks that have only played Reborn, these guys did not used to be able to carry items on them. Back in, well, technically back in SNES they could, in a very similar manner. But yeah, in PSP they had that taken away, and in this version they had it put back. And this time around, a lot of those items make a lot more sense for them to carry, and a lot of their skills are decently, more useful than they were in SNES. Yeah, SNES Griffins were, dude, them things were rough. Like, here's a unit that basically does nothing, has, like, worse movement than your basic soldiers and what have you. And potentially they can sacrifice 10% of their health bar to maybe kill something. Okay. Let's see what's next here. The ranged formula. Okay, we partially touched on this earlier. This actually applies to the same thing as the cudgel there. But it's interesting how throughout the series they've constantly been trying to figure out, like, how do we make the ranged formula work? And it's never quite worked out right. So, like, originally in the SNES version, it sort of came down to ranged and physical attacks more or less counting the same way. But what did end up happening is that melee attacks could get countered and ranged attacks couldn't. So oftentimes what you were incentivized to do was just give a ranged weapon to a melee unit, give them some armor, have them stand still, and just like run up and firing line everything, So that looked extremely goofy. It felt extremely gamey. And so let's say PSP version comes along and they suddenly have a thing where melee weapons have more of a reason to go and fight directly, but when it came to ranged weapons, they're still essentially counting the same way as everything else, which also means that they get more opportunities to attack, which also means they rank up their skills more often, which means that they snowball out of control to the point that the bows are one-shotting something and the melee guys can't even win a 1v1. So you ended up with a severely undertrained front line and a severely overqualified back line. Interesting kind of I guess you could say accidental historical accuracy there, but like they did mention in interviews that part of their goal behind everything was to try and kind of keep the threat of longbows and such, because they were something that people were legitimately scared of back in the day. But what they did this time around was that they actually did very literally keep that around, because if a unit is scared of the longbow, that's when it gets its full effect. Then effectively, when they're using their finishers, or especially their elemental finishers, they're incredibly strong, essentially potentially having way more DPS than most other physical weapons in the game. But specifically, they have to only pick on weak targets. That's the old historical question of whether plate mail was actually able to deflect arrows is a constantly flipping back and forth question. And so they kind of picked an interesting middle ground there, where like a standard shot most of the time wouldn't penetrate them, but if they think it will, or if their armor is breached, then it absolutely does go through their armor, and is potentially devastating. Or if they're using one of their finishing moves, it'll essentially count as a normal attack. I just love that little note there. Like in terms of they always try to give that sort of pseudo historical accuracy thing, but it's a cool way that they adjusted everything. Because yeah, anyone who's ever played PSP, like there's strong, and then there's like this thing is so completely busted from top to bottom that it's just not fun to use anymore. And even in my no in-cap run, absolutely ages ago, I ended up just using basic short bows, because even upgrading the Damask bow got it to the point that they were just oppressively powerful on a warrior unit. like, like you need some range support in there, but it's like, man, every kind of change that I'm making to this party still somehow feels depressing in terms of how overpowered they are. Anyway, okay, Evanescence. So this is an interesting one. There was a little quirky change that got made to Evanescence's color. So Evanescence is a skill that's exclusive to Ninja and Lord, and effectively what it is a sort of playing dead move. So back in PSP, when it says that it left the unit incapacitated, and this is actually what led me to completely redoing this ninja video as soon as I saw this. But Evanescence back in PSP literally just put them on the ground in a countdown, normal death kind of countdown. Nowhere was it actually noted that they would come back on their feet. So essentially, what it says is that they're incapacitated, which leads most folks to assume, rightfully so, that they are just taken out, right? That they're essentially self-destructing and that's it. But evanescence is actually multiple positives, not a positive and a negative, because it's not a very strong move, although it does bypass a lot of unusual defensive types. Like this actually can bypass things like evasion. And so, in its particular case, it's putting a unit into a sort of pseudo-undead state. And this was very unclear back in PSP because it just literally looked like a normal death countdown, and why are you letting that unit get to the end of their normal death countdown? And arguably it was even worse because you're looking at it and it's like, I can't use revive items on them, I can't turn them undead or whatever. What the hell is going on? Why is my unit completely broken? And it looked like it was completely broken. I think I even remember reading back in the day that some guides listed this skill as being completely broken, and or bugged or something, when in reality it just had this feature that it was so under the table that it never got utilized. And so they actually just changed the icon color when the unit gets knocked out this time to be the undead blue, which, you know, basically properly indicates like, no, this guy's coming back. It's like, oh, that's kind of a cool little thing there. And honestly, I probably would still never have picked up on it, and didn't pick up on it until I was going and testing for like 2 hours and then was like, hold on, wait a minute. This guy's getting knocked out in training. That ain't right. Like, even undead units are getting taken out. What's the deal? Again, the assumption of it's bugged until it's proven not to be. Like, just the classic Tactics Ogre experience. Okay, let's see. Next, the Storm Sounds. Yeah, the Storm Sounds just got updated in this version. They're really pretty. I like them. Let's move on. Let's see. Beast Parts and Shops. Oh, yeah. So this is just a cool little quality of life thing. But back in the PSP version, what you'd have to do is when you went and sold a beast to the shop, you'd have to go into the store and buy those items. And so oftentimes folks would just go and remake those items instead of simply, buying them at the shop. And so if you ever noticed, whenever you had sold like, an extra octopus or cyclops or something like that, you'll notice that there's a lot of items that are simply here in limited stocks here, just due to the fact that, units would essentially be able to be sold to the shop, and then you'd be able to buy them for cheaper. So, like, crafting iron ore back in PSP was a gigantic pain in the neck, because you had to craft them individually, and then those individual crafts would then have to be put into a pile, and then crafted into bars, and then those bars were bundled up into piles, and then they went into other bars. Like, it sucked, dude. It sucked severely. If you want to see more on that, there was a recent crafting video. It was just horrendous. If anyone ever told you to go play the PSP version, that alone should be a reason not to touch it with a 1,000-foot pole. The crafting, pardon my French, fucking sucked in that version. Even as somebody that advertises the hell out of that game. It was appallingly bad. Anyway, so yeah, when you would auction a monster unit, though, those parts would appear in the shop. And so let's say you were going and making an item and it happened to have some monster parts in there. If you didn't buy them from the shop, you may not know that they were in there, and it's something that would oftentimes get missed. Also, hopefully I didn't just mute it there because I had accidentally leaned on my little control button here. But oftentimes it would get missed that those items were even in the shop to begin with, whether they were scales or whatever else. So this time around, if you have them in the shop, like you've gone and you've sold those monster units to there, effectively you just have them available for here. You notice your crafting costs go down. It may not be immediately clear why, and it's mostly just due to those items being in the shop already. So it's very convenient. It's one of those, again, kind of under the table changes that's not really going to be that obvious. It's just cool that it's there. All right. Let's see what else we got here. More loyalty lore just means in general this time they added more kind of weirdly specific kind of what's going on here kind of stories. If you look at the loyalties of different units, it's just fun to theorize about. Not really too much to discuss specifically. Oh, counter-to-counter element bows. Okay, so this is actually something that I was thinking about a lot during the Union Zero run recently. But when it comes to elemental longbows, you'll notice in a lot of cases what ends up happening is that the archers will essentially be a counter to the counter of whatever the main element is of the day. So normally what happens when players reach around Chapter 2, 3, etc., you'll oftentimes see this complaint of, my archers suck and their archers are overpowered and it's not fair that they have a stat advantage. But they don't have an actual stat advantage. They actually just have an elemental advantage, and I think what the designers were going for was that people would pick up on this. So, for example, back in the first fight of Law there, right, and this is what got me thinking about it, is they have a situation where most of the units are air, and so you bring in some ice units to counter them, and then right up there on the cliff, there is a fire longbow, and they keep firing on your ice unit that's doing well versus those air units, and it makes them seem incredibly overpowered. Whereas they just have an advantage, an elemental advantage versus that unit. You could just as easily put up a filter or put up a fortify, and you would probably be able to more or less nullify that effect. But it's interesting to see that they actually have planned that out in a lot of maps, where the ambush archer of the day will typically counter the counter of the bulk of their team, because usually that's kind of how they go. They'll have holy elements assigned to healer units, not necessarily because it makes that big of a difference, but because it's a nice little kind of quality of life thing. If you have elemental bars on, it's like, how do you tell the difference between all of these hawkmen? Well, we can't introduce new sprites. We can't exactly do any of that with this engine as it is right now, but what we can do is kind of color code them with elements. And so in that particular case, it's like, okay, there's your healer guy right over there. They're always going to be divine, with like 2 exceptions, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, it's kind of a fun little deal there. Which actually probably the divine healers should have been on this list as well, because sure, they always benefit from augment light and stuff like that in the PSP version, but it does really help with color coding and just general clearness and whatnot. Okay. Next up on here is, let's see, non-waterproof armor. Oh yeah, so this is kind of an interesting one when it comes to the body armor. So with most other pieces of equipment, it's kind of a no-brainer to, for example, go upgrade your arm guards or your leg guards or your helmet or whatnot. But with the armor, it's barely a difference, defensively speaking, than its non-upgraded variant. And to my mind, this mostly just seems as a way to say, like, here's this armor, but realistically, if you don't want to have weight on there, it's really not a big deal. It's like switching over to its upgraded version is literally like 2 extra defense. Like, who cares? But it's to my mind, it just feels like a way of saying, like, look, if you want Wade, you have Wade. If you don't want Wade, you don't want Wade. Because if you don't have Wade on, you can't get pushed into the water if you're a class that can't innately swim. So this does essentially kind of bring up a question of, do you want the ability to go through the water, or do you want the ability to be immune to water? And most pieces of armor through the game will have that distinction on there, so it's just kind of cool. And what's interesting is by the time that you get to a lot of your end game stuff, a lot of them will get upgraded to Wade 2, meaning that you can walk through the water as if it's kind of just normal land at that point. So it just kind of gets upgraded further. All right. Anyway, pumpkin pie. Okay, very very weird one here. But yeah. So the meme heal. This is going to be weirdly specific from every possible angle. But what's the deal with the meme heal? So pumpkin pie is a weird skill here. This is something that used to, I believe, scale with health. Like, I think it was scaled with whatever the health was of the unit, which would be insanely powerful in this version. And it also would kind of remove its whole purpose as being a sort of meme option here, where effectively you are raining down pumpkins on somebody to heal them very slightly. And it's meant to be a joke. Like, the dude is a joke character. They are, a freaking walking pumpkin. They are effectively somebody that's been decapitated and had their head replaced with Thanksgiving. So So anyways, in order to retain its status as a meme heal, it actually got nerfed to the point that it basically does almost exactly, I think it's like 60 health or something like that. So it's weirdly enough to save somebody in emergency situations, but most of the time it's just kind of a funny move to do. It's a weirdly specific change. Again, used to heal based off how much health you had. I just really respect the kind of going out of the way to keep the meme alive. Anyway, okay. Let's see. I forget what I had for slot 22 here. That's weird. What? I probably shouldn't write my own notes as jokes, because what the hell does no mercy mean? Oh, Mother's Mercy. Right. Okay. So, okay, this was a weird one. So one of the things that happened in PSP a lot was that Mother's Blessing and Mother's Mercy would get confused all the time. Like these two skills were notorious for this. That the players would pull up their list and like, which one do I activate? Which one does what? And then you would always activate the wrong freaking one. So this time they're both just automatic. Like there you go. You don't have to worry about it. You're not going to select the wrong one. We'll do it for you. Oh man, like either one of these could have been left as an action move, and it would have been just fine. But they were both just like, no, you get to use both at once. Don't worry about it. The answer is yes. Just pick up a skill card, and you never have to worry about it again. I just love that. Okay, let's see what's next here. Save slot 1. Okay, this just applies to the in-battle save and the fact that you have one temporary save rather than the 100 perpetual saves that were there in the PSP version. Now, was this a system limitation? Was it bug? No. To my mind, I think that they were going for more of that classic SNES feeling. So classic SNES, you had to get through the whole fight without saving. Thing was, though, these fights tended to go a bit long, and occasionally you need to shut stuff down, you need to go walk away, take a break, or what have you, and so they added this perpetual save system when it came to the other versions. This started in the PS1 version, and then just kept on in the PSP version. So why wasn't it a temporary save at that point? Well, because in a lot of cases, those temporary saves could potentially bug out and just stop existing. So this happened with a lot of cases, but nowhere is it more kind of obvious and frustrating and loud than if you look at cases where, for example, players that played XCOM, like any of the new XCOMs, and tried to exit out in the middle of a save, will then realize that, you know, their save just got deleted, which would be pretty frustrating if somebody's just spent an hour on a fight and, you know, they walked away at the wrong time and now suddenly their save is just gone. So, effectively, they kind of more or less have that temporary save system figured out by this point, but those permanent saves back in the day were just basically meant as like, look, you can save as many times as you want. If something goes wrong, here's your backup plan. You know, it's kind of redundant, but whatever. And again, there's nothing like intentionally wrong with it, but it did lead to a lot of players spending a lot of time doing things like re-charioting drops and just kind of redoing the same part over and over. And just like the old grind issues back in the PSP version, this meant that oftentimes you would find yourself in this position that that somebody would get completely stuck. They're not progressing anywhere. They're not doing anything new. They're just sitting there resetting the same fight over and over, grinding the same fight over and over, instead of going and exploring the world like they were kind of hoping their players would do. So in this case, having that one temporary save kind of helps with that, you know. That it causes somebody to kind of realize that there's really no going back there. You know, what happened, and let's go ahead and continue on. Okay. Next is Peppa Pike and the Kunoichi Bow. Okay. Very oddly specific changes happened to a couple of the weapons in this version. Did I ever get Cursed Spear on the save? I don't think so. Okay, Cursed Spear and Cursed Bow. They're some of the only cursed changes that actually ended up fully happening there. But endgame spears, these actually almost exclusively run range 2 to 3, and so part of the reason that you'd use the original Cursed Spear is that it was the best 1 to 2 tile spear. So I think what happened here, and, you know, could be wrong on this, it might have just been that they wanted to bring the spear more in line with everything else. Bear in mind, this is just Dark Spear as an example of a Pike Spear. I don't have the Cursed Spear on this particular save file. But you essentially have a lot of love that was given to 1 to 2 tile spears already. See, the issue was back in PSP that your best counterattack spears were also going to be the ones that, well, that were typically on the weaker side. So things like the Volge back in PSP only had a 15% bonus off of Breach, and the actual weapon itself was doing 1 damage by the time you got to endgame. Things like the Scorpion didn't have 10% damage, it did like just 10. And so effectively it was doing roughly like, 1 in 25, 1 in 40, whatever else. It was a very tiny plink of damage that was happening. So something like a poison weapon would only be useful in situations like, let's say, let's say something like a golem, which had relatively low health, and so, for example, you could poison them, you could stop them, and then essentially poison them on top of a moss tile, or envenom them on top of a moss tile, and this would give them multiple ticks per round where they would just simply melt away. Due to the fact that Mind tends to make debuffs last longer, and they had low resistance, this meant that oftentimes the best way to handle them was something like poison, was just because you could just shut them down and watch them melt, right? However, something like the Poison Spear wasn't exactly the best way to go about that. And so these two saw basically no love, and so your best kind of 1 to 2 tile spear, if you still wanted to have a kind of counter-attacking, regularly swinging type of unit, would have been your Trident +1. Just because it was actually better than the basic Damask. Which is actually interesting that the Damask actually saw a very tiny buff to make it better than the Trident in this case. But anyway, not really that important. So yeah, even though you had these 1 to 2 tile spears that existed, there was very little reason to use anything other than the Trident until you had the Cursed Spear, which gave you your best 1 to 2 tile spear. This time around, because the Volge saw a pretty significant buff with that 50% breach thing, with their damage actually being enough to still threaten stuff later on, with stuff like the Scorpion actually seeing a pretty solid buff to the point that it is a legitimate threat later on in the game. This actually saw its attack score raised up a decent bit. You already got Short Spears getting a lot of love this time around. The Short Kings, as it were, I guess you could say. To the point that I guess they decided to make the Cursed Spear a pike instead to bring it in line with the rest. It's kind of a random change, but, fair enough, I guess. If somebody's looking for a fancier, pike spear, oftentimes, players don't really like the pike spears in a lot of cases. Like, even in the One Vision mod, you don't hear pikes used that often. But still, it just kind of gives them a bit more love, I guess. And then the bow, right? So the bow, the old cursed bow. We'll just kind of leave it on this for the moment. Actually, no, we'll leave it on this. The old cursed bow used to be a two-handed bow that could be used by one-handed bow users. It's unclear whether this was an oversight or on purpose, but oftentimes what this meant was that you would use, for example, ninja weapon buffs on a cursed bow to make a really oppressively powerful archer type of unit, right? And so what happened this time around was that we got more one-handed bow options in the form of the redundant elemental bows, and then the cursed bow was made a proper, full-on power weapon for the archer. And specifically archer and ranger and lord and such, like anybody that's actually a longbow specialist. So, yeah, it's not necessarily like ninjas needed a power weapon there. They've got other options. It's just kind of an interesting change there. I think the only one that I saw actually even noticing this and complaining about it was probably Vale. But either way, just kind of one of those interesting little random changes. Okay, let's see. What else we got on this list here? Sorry, my phone timed out here. I'm just looking at my pile here. The one lazy neutral dragon. Okay. This also falls into that category of I'm not entirely sure why they specifically got singled out. So the neutral monsters are new in this version, where you've got a lot of monsters that are essentially coming in at max level, that are just sort of there, just laying waste to enemy units and friendly units alike, right? However, there was always this thing where the very first one you ran into, over here in the Mahana Highlands, or not even in the Highlands, in the Majura Drift, there was this crystal dragon that you would run into here. And it always felt like it should drop something, and it never did. It's just a weirdly unique dragon. You don't have to fight it. And I think what they were going for was this thing that you wouldn't be able to touch it, and it would just run away. So you'd always just kind of wonder, it seems like it's there to set up that wonder the next time that you run into one of, I wonder what would happen if I actually fought that thing. Thing is, though, due to percentage scaling poison, you can actually kill it pretty easily because it can't really heal itself. So, effectively, all you need to do is bring in a ninja, fire a poison arrow at it a couple times, and it's dead. So, interestingly enough, it's the only neutral monster in the entire game to not drop anything, and this actually applies to the PSP version as well, where for some reason it had the means to drop some slightly better rings that basically any other monster can drop, but nothing else. Like, it was just sort of there. So I like to think that these neutral monsters were something that they had the idea for back in PSP, that they started implementing, and then just sort of never had the time to finish, like a lot of things in that version. So either way, it's interesting to see that they still insisted that this one specific one right here doesn't drop anything. I'm not sure why, but it feels like it's mostly there to set up the mystery. Okay, Azure and Crimson necklaces. These used to be, like, pretty hilariously overpowered, mostly due to the fact that they had stat bonuses that most other things couldn't get, and additionally had a immunity to certain debuffs. So yeah, this time around, they're just a good item. Like, they're just good. They're just not insane. The stat bonuses are mostly the same, but we don't see, for example, a stun immunity or a silence immunity on them. The Ogre Blade Mandela effect. Okay. So, okay, I feel like the Ogre Blade is, again, one of those funny weapons that's always... It's trying to do things that that otherwise make no sense. So, like, okay, let's go ahead and throw this on here real quick. So, for those who never tried it, Ogre Blade basically just allows you to body snatch somebody. It's this ability right over here, and effectively it means that a non-unique character essentially can go and body snatch somebody. So, like, Denim wouldn't be able to use it, but, like, random unit over here would be able to use it. Anybody that can use a two-hander and is generic. So let's say, what are you, a Terenius? Yeah, so, like, he would be able to, let's say, put on this weapon and then essentially switch his body with another unit. So if he were to select a lower level unit, effectively he could level up a second time while retaining his intelligence and mind stats. That he is effectively retaining his mind, but moving his self over to this other unit, and would then keep the skills that were on here. What's funny is I feel like this was put in as a sort of nod to the weird Mandela effect of the PSP version, where people would always insist, oh no, you could cross-class so many skills and make so many unique things, but you couldn't. Like, you could bring along passives that everybody would learn eventually, so most of the time, with exception to things like Meditate, you couldn't actually make any effective use of cross-classing. This time around, you can merge multiple classes together with this sword, but it's kind of interesting, the kind of whole background thing of Palace of the Dead, of trying to experiment with things that shouldn't be, or, with the kind of psychological messed up stuff that ends up happening there. To me, it feels like a nod to the whole Mandela effect thing of, like, yeah, look, this time you actually can merge your units together. Like, this was just not a thing before, now now you can. That effectively, whatever skills are learned by the unit that's transferred into the other unit will retain when they go and move them over. So, like putting Lament of the Dead on a cleric if you wanted, stuff like that. Or one of the funnier ones, Pumpkin Lore and Reflection on a fairy or something. Anyway, and then lastly, we're going to talk about the Relic Brin Hilder. Now, I'm kind of curious whether they ran into the same hard item limit that we saw the One Vision mod run into. So this is kind of going to be some speculation and such, but the Relic Brynhilder is the only, like, properly new weapon that didn't have its own slot before in this version. So if you complete Coda 4, you can get the Relic Brynhilder if you end up completing the entirety of Coda 4 using, well, I think your odds improve if it's the entirety, but you really only need to complete the last fight with 3 units, with the kind of trio the game started with the people that were there in the intro when it happened originally, right? That it's meant to be a big old therapy session for them. By the way, your odds improve if you do all of Coda 4 with those 3. That might just be completely nothing, just so you know. Personally, I always end up just redoing it with those 3 because it certainly feels like a good luck thing to make it work. There probably is no mechanical possible way to implement that, just kind of throwing that out there. Anyway, so as far as this thing goes, this is one of the one of the only new things that was added. However, there was one item that was taken away, which was the Reaver Ring, which nobody used anyway, so who cares? But I always kind of wonder if it took its slot. Because this particular sword, it's not like you're really craving a new, upgraded version of the Brin Hilder at this point. It's just kind of here. But it's an interesting little lore nod to the fact that he should have had it on him at this time. That he's not using it, it's arguably a lot better than his actual weapon, but he wasn't using it during this time. But it also leads to an interesting lore kind of speculation here, in that this thing is actually diminishing over time. And I kind of wonder if they ever, did get the green light to make the kind of finale for Ogre Battle there, if the Brin Hilder would actually break, because we see its original version, like, back before all the stuff happened there, and the thing is one of the best weapons in the game. It's going into like literally elevating that unit to godlike status, gives the ability to bring 3 people back from the dead, gives a really good bonus to weapon skills and such. Funnily enough, you can actually equip it alongside the original version too, if you just want to create a time paradox where one version parries and one version counters. But yeah. So yeah, as far as this weapon is concerned, it's kind of just interesting to look at how much it diminishes over time. Who do I actually have that thing on? Because probably could throw it. Actually, we can check. I don't know why I'm not checking. Yeah, let's go ahead and see who is wearing this thing at the moment. Merton, apparently. Yeah, that makes sense. I was using it as an offhand for him, so let's go ahead and take that off. And we'll go back to Mr. Elhrig. Go ahead and give him both swords. They actually work pretty well together, interestingly enough, because it just gives you even more resurrections for your Resurrection Knight. But yeah, like look at the difference between these. It's just diminishing over time. It's just going away. It's kind of slowly disappearing, and this is just one. Like, this is without any upgrades. This is the incomplete version. I think the complete version is like 30/bonus, 30 light, and I think 30 to 45 anti-undead or anti-phantom or whatever that is damage. But yeah, this thing has like 1/10 of the health bonus, only about 2/3 of the attack bonus. The stats just up and disappear. It's slightly faster to swing though, so I guess that's something. You lose the skill bonus, you lose a part of the resurrection. It can sort of resurrect somebody, but not completely. Like, to me, this feels like it was specifically put in here as a note, that if they do ever complete it, they're like, look, it was decaying away the whole time. The power of this weapon's been around from the beginning of the series here. Like, it's just falling apart. It's gonna just fail in the finale, as it were. Anyway, so that's kind of about that. So, hope you all found it interesting. Hope you all found it neat. That's about that I got time for here. It actually was a bit longer than I was expecting it to go. So much for staying under an hour. Yeah, I talk too much. Anyway, you'll have yourselves a good one. Take care.